And welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, very happy to have back on the show Ali Velshi, award-winning journalist for MSNBC. You see his show on the weekends. Velshi from 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time. We've talked about other books, but he's got a brand new book out, Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance, and the Fight for Democracy. Ali, welcome back to the show.
Good to be with you, my friend.
Now I know your entire life. I know everything about you. I didn't know this before. Now I know about your family. I know about much more about Kenya and apartheid laws and India. It's really interesting read. I mean, it's really about your life. It truly is about your life, but you go way back. I mean, it's interesting. The first chapter is, why does anyone leave anywhere? And you begin with your great-great-grandfather leaving India.
Yeah.
And I think it's such a great title, the idea of why do immigrants leave their country to go to whatever country? So share a little bit why your great-great-grandfather left India.
Well, so Indians started leaving India in great numbers in the 1860s, and it was a consequence of two things. One is colonialism and imperialism, which kind of wrecked India. I mean, in India before colonialism was almost a quarter of global GDP, and by the time the British left, it was 2% of GDP. I think it's maybe high single digits now. So it'll be a long time before. If India had just been left alone, India would have been one of the most powerful and important countries in the world economically. What colonialism did is it denuded it and it weakened it, and then a bunch of droughts struck in the 1800s. And so there was just no way to get out of it. And so Indians, like everybody else, like Irish, like Italians, like everybody else, looked to go elsewhere. But you went on the routes that the ships went on. So from India, they didn't go to Europe or North America. Typically, there were some exceptions, but generally speaking, you went to farther into Asia, Malaysia, Hong Kong, places like that, or you went to the West Indies, or you went to Africa. And so my family went to Africa in search of a better life. And it's kind of amazing because they lived under apartheid for so many years. I'm wondering, how is this a better life than what you left in India? But it actually was, because there was drought and they were impoverished. So they were just trying to eke out a little bit of a better living, which is exactly what immigrants to America are doing today.
It is remarkable when you think, I honestly look at people who come to this country, make it about America for a second, for a better life. There's an act of courage, like it's Small Acts of Courage in your book. And there is a nobility. I mean, they're coming here for the best of reasons. They're coming here for a better life for themselves and their family. There's very few better reasons than that.
Yes,
to
correct.
come to a country. And then, so your family goes to South Africa, and you really detail in your book the laws in South Africa, how by law and policy that people of color, Black people and Indian people, anyone who weren't white, because the white minority was trying to keep control of power. Can you share a little bit about that, and also how it impacted your family?
So, when my family got to South Africa, which was the end of the 1800s, beginning of the 1900s, it was the same as any colonial place, right? I mean, South Africa was a little different because there had been these Dutch and French Afrikaners who were fighting with the British, but it was still white people fighting with white people about who was going to control the resources and the Black people. So it wasn't entirely different than living in anywhere else where the Brits had control, or the Belgians or the Italians. The difference was that through the course of the 20th century, the South Africans just decided to look at everything that was going on in other colonial type places and say, hold my beer. We can do this much worse or much better, depending on how you look at it. And they put into law things, just basic racism that was happening everywhere else. It all became law in South Africa. The right to marry who you wanted was eliminated. The right that you couldn't engage in sexual relations with somebody of a different race. Everybody was categorized into a different race, and the state determined that. So somebody like you, Dean, maybe they're looking at you thinking, you're probably white, but you might not be. So they would put a pencil in your hair to see whether it fell out. If it fell out, you were white. If it didn't fall out, you were screwed.
I have a lot of goop in my hair. I would have stuck a lot of things. Birds get caught in my hair right now.
It was ridiculous. It was a stupid Byzantine system that created entirely different education systems for Black people. So Black people got a dictionary that was designed to make sure that you never got above the station of being a gardener or a laborer or miner or stuff like that. There's no possible way you could learn more. And by the way, it was in Afrikaans, because they didn't want them learning English. Because if you learn English, you go to the rest of the world and do things. So it was a remarkable forced labor, forced racism legal structure that we now know of as apartheid.
Yeah, and in your book, you note how in America, the the same idea with slaves. They did not allow slaves to read, to learn,
That's
because
correct.
the fear is then they have some knowledge and maybe
That's
they
right.
get out and mix in. You know, you wrote in the book that apartheid's brutality make a mockery of the idea that South Africa's Indians could be free in any way fulfilled under oppression, no matter how prosperous they were. Because your family had a bakery and were doing
Yep.
pretty good, but the government really had an eye on them while they were doing this.
That's right. And so in any society, there can be a trade-off, right? You can sit there and say, I don't really enjoy full rights, or people around me don't enjoy full rights, but the money's pretty good. And in a lot of places where Indians settled outside of India, that happened, right? They were in this middle space. They weren't as well off, or as they didn't enjoy the privileges that white people did, but they weren't as badly off as the whatever the native groups were. And that can get you into trouble. In my family, they went from just feeling prosperous and saying, well, let's not rock the boat, into saying this is unjust. And it's a little more just for us than it is for black people, or what they called colored people, who are mixed race people, but it's not fair. And so we're going to fight it. And in societies like that, when you fight for your civil rights, or anybody's civil rights, they come for you.
I'm sorry, but Ali Velshi about his new book, Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance and the Fight for Democracy. Next stop in the Velshi family, Kenya. So why did your family explain a little bit why Kenya and what did they find there?
Well, they needed to get out of South Africa, first of
Right.
all, because the government was really coming down on them for their involvement in anti-apartheid activities. And some people in the family, my dad, a couple of his siblings had married people in Kenya. That was sort of the way out. Kenya, when they got to it, was pre-independence. So for them, first of all, it seemed very free. It was still a colonial place, but they didn't have these Byzantine apartheid laws about you can only walk on the street on a Tuesday and only on this side of the street. So Kenya felt free. Kenya then had independence. So my parents were in Kenya for the birth of a democratic nation. It was the first vote. They're in their adult lives. They'd never been able to vote. It was the first time they were able to vote. So they really thought that this was freedom. You could walk, you could go to the movie theater. You didn't have special sections for black people and Indian people and white people. They really, really loved Kenya. And it was where I was born, actually. The problem was in the scheme of the end of the British Empire, which, started to come apart in the 40s, and then India got independence in the late 40s. And then by the 50s and 60s, there were these black independence movements in India, as there should have been. And those are the independence movements that subsequently became the governments of those countries. But because Indians always occupied this middle space, they weren't fully welcomed into that either. So now they've gotten out of apartheid. It's not as bad as apartheid, but they didn't see that there was necessarily a future for them in a place like Kenya either.
So you're born in Kenya, but then your family moves to Canada, and it just kept getting closer and closer. It goes from India, South Africa,
Yeah.
up to Kenya, now to America. I mean, to Canada. And it's just thing you note that in Canada, you became Indian and that you got in touch with your Indian roots. Share a little bit about that. I was intrigued by that.
Well, because it was a society back then. I mean, Canada is one of the most multicultural places on earth by design, but it wasn't in 1970, 1971 when my family got there. And so everybody was kind of white or not. My best friend on the block was Sicilian. And they all thought we were brothers, because either you're like white, which means you're Irish, you're French, you're Protestant, Scottish, or you're English, right? That's white. And then everybody else is something else. And so we were the something else. And of course, once people got a little more sophisticated in the fact that all ethnic people were not related, broadly, we just became Indian. And we would go to, my grandmother would wear a sari every day, and she would go to Indian movies, and I'd go with her. So we hadn't really grown up culturally Indian, but there was Indian food and there was language. And this happens to a lot of people. I think to you a little bit as well, where you start to connect with your history a little bit more when you're in an environment that doesn't have it. And so I associated much more with being Indian growing up in Toronto than I ever thought that I would have.
You also celebrated Christmas in Canada, which is kind of interesting for the brown Muslim family. So your friend Mikey's half Sicilian. He's also part Arab like me. So I'm half Sicilian. I'm half Arab.
Correct,
He was a mix of things. But you mentioned multiculturalism in Canada, and that was actually a policy of
a
the
policy.
country of Canada for a reason. They made a decision. Can
Yes.
you share a little? People don't know the history of Canada.
Yes, and it's remarkably relevant today because
Mhm.
labor shortages. It was a developed country where women who had not worked were going to work, which meant people were having fewer children, which meant you had a negative birth rate. You literally had a workplace replacement rate, which wasn't replacing itself. So you needed immigrants. And so Pierre Trudeau, who was then the justice minister, he would subsequently become the prime minister. He and the prime minister at the time sat around and said, what do we do? What do we do to actually attract people here? Because everybody's going to the UK or they're going to the United States. And so they said, we're going to develop this thing called multiculturalism, which was an actual policy, which meant you come to our country, you keep your culture, we will teach your children their own language at the public expense. So if there are 25 kids in a school that speak Italian, you get after school Italian lessons. You can do all, we just need you to come here and
Right.
work. And the concept was that you would not be fearful of losing your culture, so you'd come to Canada, but somehow you'd feel so included and it would work so well that you would become Canadian inherently. And that's what Canada has today. It's a place that loves immigrants. It's a place that immigrants can maintain whatever it is about their culture that they want. And yet they're all Canadian. They all watch hockey all the time. They're involved in politics. They're involved in civil society. It really worked. Dean, I was in Toronto the other night for a fundraiser for the Toronto Public Library. All the proceeds go to new Canadians, right? We
Wow.
we think about immigrants so differently in Canada than we do in the United States. Here, it's under Homeland Security. It's a security threat. Immigrants are the thing about immigrants is to not make them a security threat in America. In Canada, people go and hug immigrants. And the same problem. There's housing shortages. There's,
Mhm.
because lots of people, 10,000 people a month, I've heard, come to a place like Toronto. Incredible pressures on the infrastructure and the housing. But Toronto was a podunk little place when I grew up. It was a
Really?
provincial little
It's
town
like New
that was
York.
never going to be a world-class place. And it's the immigrants, lots of them, Chinese, Portuguese, Italian, Trinidadian, Jamaican, every kind of immigrant came to Canada, and that's what's made it the place it is today.
Yeah, I went on a comedy tour for a Muslim or an Arab Canadian group a few years ago, and I remember doing comedy. But I would watch the speakers, and one talked about in Canada that it's not a melting pot like America; it's a salad, and that
Right.
we're all mixed together, but you still
Yes.
can remain whole.
You can
While in
still
America,
pick
it's like
out
we
the
want to
red
melt you
pepper
down.
and the
Right,
olive
right,
and the tomato. You know that everything's different, but it's fantastic as a salad, right?
right.
These things are always I've never heard that analogy, and that is really true. It's a beautiful thing. And America's got most of the ingredients for that, by the way, and it's got more people who want to come here than want to go to any other place in the world. So it's still got the advantage, but it's starting to squander it, Dean, because America's getting a reputation in these other countries as anti-immigrant and somewhat racist. I don't believe that to be true because immigrants get welcomed to this country all the time.
Sure.
But the rhetoric that we continue to hear, the vermin, the animals, the implied threat, it's just not, it doesn't even bear out statistically, Dean. Immigrants don't commit more crimes than native-born Americans do. It's a fact.
No.
You know why? Because they've got a massive disincentive to commit crimes because they're going to get thrown out, deported, go back home. Like none of it's true. Immigrants get the job done, as Lin-Manuel Miranda says, and we need them. We've got a low unemployment rate. We need to lean into immigration the way Canada did in the 70s and onward.
Maybe a way to push back against the vile libels that Trump spews about immigrants and crime and all that. In newspaper articles, we should say where people are born, like native born person John Smith.
Yes.
Everyone who attacked the Capitol, I'm pretty sure we're born in America.
Right.
So it's kind of interesting where this idea that if you're not born in America, I'm sure, because I've researched this as well. Statistically, it's no different. People who are immigrants are not committing more crimes. Like you said, probably even less because they want to be citizens. They know they're going to lose.
But they do, by the way, create more jobs than native born Americans because many of them are entrepreneurs. They go to Silicon Valley, they do a startup. Then they'll, it's just this concept of it. They say the immigrants drive wages down. We're at under 4% unemployment and wages have done nothing but go up for the last few years. Like none of it's actually true, but it's a mindset, right? Again, immigration should be handled by the Department of Immigration. It should be an economic imperative. But in America, it's handled by the Department of Homeland Security. It falls under the category of potential threat. It's just the way we think about it. We've got to change.
I like that. I think you're right. If I run for president, it's going to be one of my platform ideas. It's going to be the idea. And speaking of running for office, so your father not only comes to America in Canada, an immigrant, he runs for office and ultimately wins. He loses the first time and wins, making history. Share a little bit about why your dad, an immigrant to this country, a very white country, goes, you know what? I'm going to go run for office.
Very strange. In 1981, when he first decided to do that, he gathered around family and friends, and everybody looked at him like, you're an idiot. This isn't going to happen. And then he goes to run as a liberal in a constituency that had been a conservative constituency for 42 years. And the incumbent was the health minister. Now, in Canada, because it's a public health system, universal health care, the health minister is the equivalent like the attorney general. Like it's the biggest line item in the budget, right? So a conservative in a conservative constituency who happens to be the health minister, like that's about as running against that is kind of nuts. And he did it. He ran against him and he lost. And I was with him in the car. I was 11 years old and I was very disappointed because the radio came on. It was 8 o'clock. Polls had closed. My dad and he'd gone home to change. We were in the car and the radio comes on and it says, too close to call. The polls are closed, except for this one constituency, which was the one my dad ran in because they were so 100% clear that my dad was never going to win.
Right.
That they called it within 30 seconds of the polls being closed. Now, I don't know anything about advanced polls and things like that when I'm a kid. And I look at my dad and I say, I can't believe we lost. And he looks at me and he goes, of course we lost. And I said, what do you mean, of course we lost? And he said, we were never going to win. And I said, well, why did we run then? Why did we do this? And he said, because you can. Because now we've lost and tomorrow life goes on and no one goes to jail. No one gets arrested. We pull up to the campaign office. He goes in the back, gets on the phone, calls the guy who won. They have a cordial conversation for a minute. He concedes defeat, and life goes on. He did subsequently run and win and become the first South Asian and the first Muslim elected to a parliament in Canada. But the better story is the day he lost. I learned more about politics the day he lost than the day he won. The day he won, it's like, oh, we got more votes. That's why we won. But losing, understanding how to lose is something we are starting to forget how to do in our politics. That politics is about being involved. Politics is about putting your view and your voice forward and seeing if more people will vote for you than the other guy. And if they don't, stay in the system and keep working to fix things and do things the way you want to do them.
So your father didn't get his supporters to go around the Capitol and try to charge it and fight for Velshi, fight for Velshi. That didn't happen.
Unbelievable.
So, interesting, huh?
In
wow,
fact,
that's
the guy my dad defeated when he won in 1987. Really nice guy. Write about him in the book. His name is David Lindsay. To this day, when I go to Toronto to make a speech, David Lindsay shows up. Right? The only connection to my family is that my father defeated him in an election. And he's a conservative. My father's a liberal. So it's not even polarization. It's the opposite. Right? It's pluralism. This guy comes and hangs out to show support to the son of the person who defeated him in an election.
Yeah. Well, it's a great testimony to the illness that the American politic body has right now. Like we have a cancer and it's metastasizing worse and worse. But let's get back to your book. I'm chatting with Ali Velshi about his book, Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance in the Fight for Democracy. So growing up in Canada, how did you view the United States? Because I know it's on TV all the time. You see everything we do, but what was it like? Was it like an experiment? Was it like watching Nat Geo? What was it like watching America?
I got the impression that America was burning because our news came from Buffalo. And Toronto was an old British city that had brick houses and brick buildings. Buffalo, for whatever reason, had wood construction. And that was in the day when people would smoke and they'd fall asleep on their sofa and their house would burn down and they'd fall asleep in the bed. Remember that used to happen, right? People would smoke in bed. Can you believe it? And so the news from Buffalo that would come on our networks, if you were watching CBS or ABC or NBC, the news would always carry on about a 5-alarm fire. Always 5-alarm fire or a shooting. So, and we didn't have shootings in Canada because there were no guns. And we hardly had fires in Canada. Right. So this impression is three things. America's burning all the time. There's an awful lot of shooting people. And there were commercials for Carvel, which we didn't have in Canada. And it's important. It was amazing, those Carvel commercials. And I grew up a little bit angry at America because why show me these commercials if I can't ever have it? So those are the things I grew up. But no, when I was a kid, we didn't have all this Canadian content. They did that ultimately to get Canadian artists played on TV or on radio to build up the industry. But back then it was all American. So I grew up watching the same TV, the same shows that every American kid grew up watching. So I felt a great kinship to America, but that was in the days before free trade. We didn't even have that much to do with each other. But culturally, you grew up with the same kind of stuff. And I will say culturally, with some exceptions, the countries didn't feel that different back then. You made a point of articulating that you were Canadian when you went around the world, but mostly out of pride, just so that people didn't confuse you with being American. And Americans like to go around the world with little Canadian flags on their jackets and their backpacks because Canadians were sort of liked a little bit more. They weren't
Sure.
they didn't get involved in wars and things like that. But I loved the idea of America when I was growing up. I was always in awe of the place, and whenever I'd go back after I lived in America, when I first moved here, people say, "What do Americans think of us?" And I said, "They don't really."
Yeah, but that changed, right? As you know in your book, that changed when Donald Trump won. So now
Canada became
happens?
like this hit thing that everybody was like, "Hey, why can't we have that?" It totally changed.
Look, you might have new immigrants in Canada. I know you're a U.S. citizen now, but there might be. Look, I got to be honest. If Trump gets in and it's potentially as bad as people think, no one wants to be the last one out.
No, and for people like you and me, where we talk about this on a daily basis, I mean, these guys are they're building an enemies list. There's no question. Now, what you do with your enemies list is it could just be that suddenly Dean Obeidallah finds himself audited every year by the IRS, but it could be more serious. I mean, it's not something that I don't think about. That I love this country. My family's from this country. I love this country. I love Canada too. But I do worry about a future in this country if some of the things that Donald Trump and the people who support him talk about come out to be true.
I think people like Obeidallah, Ali Velshi, Ayman Mahmoudin, Mehdi Hassan, a lot of people are going to be
we're going to be on the top of some lists.
We're going to be doing a show from some camp somewhere together. Right. I'll be the comedy show. It's going to be, oh boy, we have to laugh. So you open the book about becoming a U.S. citizen, and Ashley Banfield, I know Ashley, I haven't talked to her in a few years, but I used to talk to her, go on her shows and stuff like that, said, "You're here for years in America, and she's Canadian too. Why didn't you become a U.S. citizen?" So what made you finally go, okay, I'm going to be a U.S. citizen?
Well, not a whole lot. Partly because I'd said to Ashley, well, I don't have to go to jury duty if I'm not a citizen. Although they summons you for jury duty all the time, and then you have to tell them you're not a citizen,
right.
Which is a lot of work. And she lit into me. She said, "That's a ridiculous excuse. You enjoy the fruits of living in a country, and you have obligations as a citizen." And boy, have I realized that in the last few years, that it's not just the obligation to serve on a jury. That might even be the smallest of them, important though it is. It is all your obligations as a citizen, your obligation to use your First Amendment rights, your obligation to speak for those who don't have a voice, your obligation to say society is not equal. I may be enjoying the fruits of society, but if it's not equal for someone else, then it's just not equal, right? If one of us are in chains, all of us are in chains. So I began to understand that I can't just live here and mooch off the benefits of being American and carry on about how I'm a Canadian. So I became an American citizen, although I did in 2015. And by 2016, late 2016, that was looking like a uniquely bad decision. But now I'm both.
So your family went through a lot of small acts of courage to get you here. How do they inspire you today? And are there any specific small acts of courage that you've taken that you can look back and say, I was inspired by a family member jumping in a ship and swimming through shark-infested waters, like as it talks about in the book. Like, what is it that you've been inspired by?
Well, I'm inspired by the fact that when you look at the world we're in, this troubled world in which democracy in America feels imperiled, democracy around the world feels imperiled. You've got Russia and Ukraine. You've got Israel and Gaza. You've got school shootings. It's too much sometimes, Dean. It feels like too much. And then I realized that the people who are busy changing the world, the ones who have changed the world in the past, including the Gandhis and the Mandelas, it's 30 years since the end of apartheid, the Martin Luther Kings of the world, they just did what was in front of them to start with, right? You just take the thing you can actually do, have the impact you can have, plant the seed of the tree under whose shade you will not sit, under, of which fruit you will not eat. right? The point, my grandfather died at the age of 58 in South Africa after fighting apartheid. He was Gandhi's youngest student on his ashram in South Africa. He died thinking the whole thing had failed. He died thinking he hadn't moved the needle at all. And his son would go on to be a member of parliament in Canada. And his grandson would be me. He didn't know that. He had no idea.
Right. Sure.
He thought it was done. He thought it didn't actually work. But the things that they do, the influences that they give you, and today it's not about your grandchildren, your great grandchildren. It's just influence somebody. Do the right thing. I talked to Tim Snyder from Yale about these threats to democracy, and I said, "Well, what can my viewers do?" He says, make sure you're a member of the library. Make sure you pay for your local news. If there's a local news organization, support them with the subscription. Make sure you stay involved. Go to your school board meetings. Make sure you vote in 100% of the elections you're in and register other people to vote and take them with you to vote. Because if everybody took one other person with them to vote, we'd have 100% turnout in elections. Just do the right thing. They don't have to be big things. That's my point. This is meant to be inspirational. My family history is full of a bunch of people who did little things that did not look like they were going to be consequential. None of them were famous. You'd have never known any of their names. But the result has been remarkable. And the obligation of that, Dean, is that if they did all those things so that I can be where I am today, I had better do my part too. We don't get to just bask in the sun. We have to actually work for it.
And that's a great point. And again, Ollie, congratulations on the new book, Small Acts of Courage, A Legacy of Endurance and the Fight for Democracy. It was great. I know you for years, but now I really know you. Now I know your family and your own evolution as a person and through the history. It's kind of remarkable. My family just went from Sicily to America and from Palestine to America. That was it.
But these things in between are all acts of courage, right? Like the idea that somebody makes a decision. What boat do you get on? What's that life
from
like?
Sicily, I know, like in 1890s,
the passage to come to America was horrible.
Sure.
So like they're all courage. Leaving your hometown as much as it doesn't make sense to stay. It's all courage. You're doing it so that you or someone after you will enjoy something better in life. And it works. That's my point. Little things make a difference. My grandfather jumped off a boat in the Indian Ocean. I think he just wanted to get not eaten by sharks. But in the end, he created a legacy and a life and an obligation to fight for democracy, to fight for equality, to fight for freedom, to fight for liberty. And if the book tells anybody anything, it's that I didn't fall off a turnip truck with this one. I have been steeped in this idea of pluralism and equality and liberation for so long. What a privilege that I've got to be able to have this conversation with you today, that you and I are having this conversation. My grandfather wouldn't believe this. He couldn't even imagine such a thing would happen.
True. And it's all small acts. And I think we're all going to have to be taking a lot of small acts if you want to preserve democracy going forward. Well, Ollie, again, great seeing you, my friend. Congratulations on the book. I look forward to chatting with you in the future.
We will chat many times. Thank you, my friend.
Take care.